So from now on, this session is being recorded. I just started the recording just to let everybody know once more. So hello and welcome everyone. We are very happy to have you here for this special occasion of learning about cognitive linguistics and conversation design in a webinar from Laura Grimm and Anne Lindner. And a special thanks to Laura and Anne, whom you see on the right, and also to Die Lautmaler for providing us with the possibility to hold this webinar over Zoom. Just a few words about our speakers, and then just a few words about the agenda, and then I will hand over to Laura and Anne. So the both of them studied language in its multiple facets at Humboldt University and TU in Berlin, and obtained their degrees in language and communications with a focus on cognitive linguistics. There, Anne furthermore also focused on phonetics and phonology. Laura has been working as a conversation UX designer at Die Lautmaler for 1.5 years, and for Anne it has been over 2 years now since she started working at VUI Agency as a VUI designer. They are both fascinated by language, being equally innate and enigmatic, and are now kind enough to share their knowledge with us, which, judged by the large number of people who wanted to participate and are participating, is highly appreciated by the voice community. The webinar will consist of 3 chapters, and just as organizational remarks, please write your questions in the Q&A section that you can find on the bottom of your screen, and Anne and Laura will come back to your questions after they have finished with the theoretical part of the talk. Enough said. If you have any administrative issues or questions, just ping me personally in the chat. And for now, I will hand over to Laura and Anne. Enjoy.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna Maria, for this introduction. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I don't know if shocked is the right word, but that's the first that comes to my mind, that there are actually so many people interested. So yeah, we will give our very best to give you an overview about cognitive linguistics. And I guess we'll just start. And yeah, I think we don't have to repeat who we are, what we do. From my side, I also want to thank to Manja and Norbert from Lautmaler to provide us with the Zoom. That's just great. I'm really, really thankful. And yeah, let's just start. There are 3 parts on our agenda. It's pretty classic. So we start with what is cognitive linguistics? What are interesting findings? And why should we bother as conversational designers or everybody working in the voice field? And yeah, so what is cognitive linguistics? Actually, cognitive linguistics is an ensemble of theories and approaches. And the goal is to analyze natural language. And we understand language as a tool to organize, process, and convey information. So one of the core issues for cognitive linguistics is the nature of mental representations and the underlying meaning of, cognition and language. So just because, it's an introduction, so of course we need some quotes from important people, and also, of course, this is a huge reduction. So the basic idea is that still nowadays can be found in cognitive linguistics date back to the 19th century. So we have Humboldt writing about his Weltansichten or worldviews, arguing that there are as many concepts of the world as there are languages. So then in the 20th century, we see Wittgenstein and his very, very famous claim that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And this is probably one of the highly discussed quotes in modern philosophy, especially because Wittgenstein himself gave so many different interpretations on this quote, and it's still highly discussed in cognitive linguistics. So in the 1920s, we see Sapir with his ideas that also have been the basis of many, many reflections, but the actual turning point together with the cognitive turn comes with Noam Chomsky. And so he's like the father of modern linguistics and also built the foundation of what became cognitive linguistics later. And so after that, Chomsky's own students, so Leike and Helmi, they changed Chomsky's idea and created those notions of language that we are discussing right now. And so when we have the linguistic relativity, which is or might be considered as one of the influences for cognitive linguistics, everybody who has already been diving into this will know how a complicated notion of linguistic relativity is. We're going to go back to that a little later. But then we have general grammar with Chomsky and different movements within cognitive linguistics, which are generative semantics and cognitive semantics. And I promised that this is already the end of the very boring part, and now it's going to be a little more interesting, I hope. So as we mentioned, Chomsky, it's also highly discussed whether Chomsky theory should be considered as part of the canonical interpretation of cognitive linguistics. But this is something we won't discuss here, but we definitely can't discuss it without just mentioning what is so special about what Chomsky developed.
So yeah, let's elaborate a little bit on generative grammar. It's kind of a counter concept to Skinner's behaviorism. In his view, language would be something we just imitate and we get corrected over and over until we finally master it. But Chomsky argues this cannot be true because of little and too faulty input, because the stimulus we get, our children get, is totally faulty, very incomplete, and can't lead to the everythingness you can say with language. So generative grammar is based on the idea that all humans have an innate language capacity. It mainly focuses on morphosyntax and putting language into rules and finding patterns and regularities that are supposed to underlie every single language and that can be decoded. And the basic concept, that innate language capacity, is what Chomsky called the language acquisition device. And with a language acquisition device, Chomsky wants to explain how children acquire internalized knowledge of grammar with remarkable speed. And on the basis of fragmentary and degenerate input data, as I already said, and this hypothetical device is the same for every human, and emphasis on hypothetical device. So please don't think of it as an actual thing you have in your brain that helps you learn your language. And this thing reacts to the input language and will set up a certain set of rules for that language. And even though it was really extraordinary at the time, it didn't take long until the first critics showed up. And what they critiqued was the fact that all of Chomsky's approaches were based on not actual spoken languages. And it's what he called the ideal speaker. And it ignored all the aspects of language that were not rule-based, so cognition and how language and cognitive processes are intertwined being just one of them.
And this is where cognitive linguistics enters the stage. So basically it was Chomsky's own students who came up with the elaboration on his ideas. And they wanted to create a holistic picture. So the goal is to eliminate the boundaries between the different parts of linguistics, so morphology, phonology, and so on, and to combine them into, yes, just one theory where all the different aspects are recognized equally. So they said that you cannot only focus on the output and the structure of the output, but you need to understand the psychological and also the neural correlations that determine and shape it.
And yeah, this is what makes cognitive linguistics an essential part of cognitive sciences. So, but still there are different movements within cognitive linguistics when it comes to the question on how language and cognition influence, shape, and determine each other. And yeah, who of you has seen the motion picture Arrival? It's the one with the linguistic expert who must interpret the language of aliens. And yeah, this movie has many inaccuracies, but the greatest being a linguistic professor living in a very modern mansion in the middle of the woods. It's a very big house, it's very beautiful. But yeah, maybe one of the many faulty statements in this movie.
So, but what actually happens in this movie is that what we already mentioned, linguistic relativity, has been brought up. And spoiler alert, this is what helps actually to understand the whole idea of the film. And it says that language shapes the way we think and determines what we can think about. So this is a very, very strong notion of what language means when it comes to the intertwinedness of cognitive processes and language. So this idea goes back to Benjamin Lee Whorf. It's already 100 years old, but always finds its way again and again and again into cognitive linguistics, and it's going to be critiqued over and over again. So we won't miss to present one of the most popular and extremely controversial claims.
Yeah, and yeah, here a complete opposition stated by Steven Pinker. The idea that thought is the same thing as language is an example of what can be called a conventional absurdity. So Steven Pinker refuses the idea that language can directly influence our perception. Language might only help to understand the working of the mind in a very reduced and very twisted way. And over the years, many different theories between those two rather radical positions have been developed and discussed, and it always turns out to be really hated or just, let's say, very passionate arguments within the world of linguistics.
That I think what everybody agrees on is that this is how we actually perceive how language and the mind go together. So what we need to understand is that cognition in the very first place only allows us to store let's say, a schematic approach of what we call reality or the world. So we don't capture our surrounding like a photo where we take like a photo or a screenshot of a exact situation, but it's more like a mental collage. So where we combine snippets of memories and we transform them in size, in shape, in color, in meaning. This is also where biases come in, because we perceive the world very, very differently. We perceive every single aspect of what we realize based on our own experiences of the cultural practices we live with, we were born in. And we have so many patterns that we apply unconsciously to every single second where we perceive what is around us. And then while we put our memories, our perceivings into words again, we create completely new images and ideas within our listeners' minds. And how our listeners will perceive whatever we say is also shaped by their own representations and memories.
Yeah, and speaking of different mental models, there are many different mental models available. And one kind that is especially important in the context of cognitive linguistics is the image schema. A core issue for cognitive linguistics is the nature of the mental representations that underlie meaning itself. Are they abstract and detached from our embodied experience, a sort of language or thought or mentalese? Who knows? Or are they fine-grained sensory-motor representations? One idea that has emerged in the cognitive linguistic literature falls between these alternatives and proposes a kind of mental representation called image schemas. So we integrate all of our experience and the different sensomotory input, what we learn and reproduce via language, and combine all those information to cohesive pictures that fit our expectations and the concepts we have acquired. And so we know if we, for example, as you see here, go to a restaurant, we know through our mental model, through our image schemas, what we can expect if we go there. We know the special sequences, we get seated, we get the food, we pay for the food, we leave. And we all know this before we actually go into the restaurants, because we have mental models and what represents to be in a restaurant, what it means to be there, and what we do there as humans. And this way of our mind working might lead to the following. And I think we all agree on the fact that there are no two triangles on this picture on the right. They're just angular lines and 3 Pac-Man-ish forms you can see there. But at the same time, it makes perfectly sense to describe this visual input as being, in fact, 2 triangles. Our mind is putting things into context of known patterns and images. It's like looking at clouds in the sky and finding shapes and things and animals and people in them, because that's what our minds do. This is so a perfect example of Gestalt Theory described by Aristoteles. The whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. And we will use language in the most economic way. And when we describe the huge overall picture, we will probably ignore most of the details that actually constitute to it. And this is something called the stage metaphor that describes this wonderfully.
And this is something that you probably have heard of when you've already been in touch with cognitive science. So we can imagine the world and how we verbally interact with it, like people watching a scene in a theater or a cinema, and not 2 people in the world would describe the scene that happens in front of them in the same way. So they would always choose different words, they would choose different settings, and by doing that they will always give a lot of information about themselves. So to start with basic spatial information, like the stairs are in front of me, so this gives a concrete idea of the relation, the spatial relation you have with the stairs, and maybe also the emotional relation you might have with the stairs, who knows, because this is also a lot of information that you're gonna give by the way you put things into words, the emphasis you're gonna choose, how you recreate on a verbal way what you have as a visual input. And on the other hand, based on those descriptions, there are not 2 people in the world who are going to draw the same picture while listening to the to this description. This is what I've already talked about, that we are also, while hearing something, we're going to interpret it in our own ways and add a lot of information, biases, information that we already have had in our lives. And when we talk about metaphor and cognitive linguistics, we can't do this without also talking about conceptual metaphors. So this is really, really basic and important for us, because metaphors and linguistics are a lot more than just stylistic elements in literature. So we basically can't talk without using metaphors, and it's not only nouns or aphoristic expressions, but everything. When we talk and we take a concept from one source domain and we verbally and also conceptually transfer it to an unrelated domain. So we have the very classical, in English at least, notion of time is money, but also stuff like falling in love. This is also a metaphor, because we, by saying falling in love, we perceive and conceptualize love like a vessel where you can actually physically dive into. So this is what we also call dead or lexicalized metaphors, and those have perfectly merged into language. We can't even realize that it's not a word by word meaning of what we say. And this is a great example for spatial metaphors that have been big part of different domains. So we talk about directions, we talk about up and down, and we take those notions and put them into different concepts. And the funny thing here is that we can even take the notions from one source domain, which is direction, and put it into different goal domains. So we can have it for up can stand for something unknown or something positive, something good, or something known or bad, which seems completely contrary, and we don't even realize it. And we just do it. We just talk that way. And those are all processes that derive from our lives, from our experiences in the world, with or without language. And we communicate by using them and not even realize how we do that.
Yeah, now we can take a short breath and stop with the theory, and we would enter our second part of today's webinar. Let's dig into some interesting findings about, firstly, language and memory. And yeah, let's dive right into it. We start with an experiment from Loftus and Palmer. And what they did was they showed participants sequences of cars having a very light accident. Of course, this was on videotape form, and the participants can see two cars slightly bumping into each other. So maybe accident is a strong word, but two cars slightly touching them. And then after some days were passed, the participants were asked the question that you can see there in the speech bubble. So about how fast were the cars before they smashed? And the interviewers would exchange the used verb phrase. They would say smashed, they would say bumped into, they would say touched. And let's say the stronger the verb, because touched, the cars touched, or the car smashed into it, this invokes different concepts. And this was the finding. The stronger the verb was, the faster the speed the participants assumed got. So they saw two cars slightly bumping into each other. And if we asked them, how fast were they before they smashed? They would really assume it was very, very fast, although they did not see two cars smashing very, very fast into each other. And not only that, participants were asked if there was shattered glass, and the participants would also answer differently depending on the verb the interviewer used. And I mean, keep in mind, they all saw the same little accident, merely a fender bender, but participants stated that they clearly remembered broken windows depending on the different words used, because those words come with different mental models indicating different scenarios and outcomes. And those results are key to handle eyewitnesses and how reliable memory can or cannot be.
And in the same direction goes an experiment by Forse and Boroditsky that, let's just mention that the studies of Boroditsky, and there are a lot, they managed to do something really great. They managed that a lot of experiments were reproduced. So this in science is often a problem, that yes, experiments are not reproduced, and Boroditsky's experiments have been reproduced a lot because they seem so unlikely. And it's really, really interesting because different studies that reproduce find different results, but never actually refusing all of the theories that Boroditsky came up with. So one of the experiments are based on the grammatical structure of languages. And when describing events involving a person acting intentionally, but especially accidentally, languages tend to have different grammatical structures to describe this. So we have English, and when a person would drop a vase accidentally, people tend to say the person broke the vase. And in Spanish, if they say, or if they see the exact same situation, they would probably say something like, se rompió el florero. So the vase broke itself. So Spanish speakers are less likely to picture or to verbalize the person that was acting in the scene. So turns out that after a while, when participants were asked about the scene they have been seeing before, the English speakers who would mention the person acting and breaking the vase would remember the persons way better. So there were different t-shirts, and English speakers would just remember them way better than Spanish speakers.
And from this all memory fun to language and the influence onto perception. There's one subject that keeps coming up over and over again since the late 60s, and this is the matter of color naming in the context of perception. Because the question that is brought up here is, do people perceive colors differently if their mother tongue has a different inventory of words for those colors? And the study from Berlin and Kay claimed that this would be the case. They even established a sequence in which language developed words for colors, and just for your interest in this, and the sequence is the same for all over different languages. Just to name the starting points for every language, first, it's a distinction between lighter, warmer, and cooler, darker expressions. And if a language has these, the language always develops more expressions. And the more words should always be, it is always red that comes after those two distinctions for lighter, warmer and darker, cooler colors, and red always becomes for yellow and green. But yeah, actually, Berlin and Kay revised their own conclusions and methods later, and as did a lot of their critics. Some of them see this also as an ethnocentric bias based on traditions of Western scientific thought, because mainly it promotes the idea of progress, and where more expressions or terms are a sign of cultural progress. And this is definitely not the case. But you would think of, okay, if English has 12 basic words for colors, and this is more than in other cultures where they only have 5. And then you would see them as more progressed. And yeah, really, we need to address this. This is not the case. And this leads to an aspect that is actually very important when it comes to studying cognitive linguistics, and because it can become actually very harmful if we are not aware of it. Especially in the early stages of cognitive linguistics, and their roots, like the basis of linguistic relativity, have over and over again confused those differences with the notion of supremacy. Misled by their own biases, they concluded that people might be unable to actually have certain concepts or thoughts all together. And just because they don't have the same grammatical or lexical structures as Western. Yeah, this exoticized other languages and reinforced racist stereotypes by making people believe that the brains of the speakers would actually work different. And when they say different, yeah, this dangerously leans very, very close to the concept of less advanced.
And this shows perfectly how important it is to be aware of the language we use even while studying language, and how we can ourselves go into harmful stereotypes while judging other languages, or having concepts of why do people say things another way I do, this is weird. And no, it's not. It's language, and it's perfectly normal, and it's perfectly beautiful. So yeah, let's go to the next point, which is language and conceptualization. So this is also something we stay on the focus of bias, which is always very important as we talk about language and mind. And let's go to the next findings.
Yeah, this is one very interesting finding on gendered expressions. So if a language has gendered expressions, for example, we in Germany do have them, in Dutch too, in English not so much, but if a language has these, this study found out that girls are more likely to take on jobs when they are presented with job titles matched in gendered couples in their respective language. So in German, this would be engineers and female engineers. And when the girls were presented with only the masculine plural, only for us engineers, the professions are considered much harder to learn for girls. And in particular, not less likely for them to take this. And if they're presented with the gendered form, they are very, very more likely to take them and think that they could actually do them. So representation matters in language too.
And at the same time, one perfect example of how unconscious all these processes happen is a pretty old study from William Leboeuf, who has asked speakers how they would judge greetings and saying goodbye. And it was really funny because it turned out I would never say bye-bye. So they were asked how they would say goodbye to people. They would say goodbye, see you, many different variations. And many speakers said that they would never use bye-bye because it's childish, it's unprofessional, it's something only children would say. And turns out, as you see in the graphics, that there's a huge gap between how people would judge their own vocabulary and the words they would actually use. So this is just so good to see, and this also shows how different or twisted it can be when we think about Chomsky and his idea of the ideal speaker, because people actually have no idea how they really talk. They're pretty unconscious about the words they use, and especially when they are asked about it, they would say that they have a different level. And this is also where social bias comes in. This is also when in German and in other languages too, we have this debate of using correct language, which actually doesn't exist, especially in spoken language. And people would say, I would never use these or those construction because it's false. And then when you see them talk, they would of course do it, because language is pretty simple when in use, and language always finds the easiest way when used. And yeah, so we come to the last aspect, which would be language and spatial cognition. And this also shows how amazing the combination of language and mind is, because what we see here is that people will, when asked, how is this put? How is this, what do you see? People will always say the bottle stands on the table or the bottle lies on the table. And this is because we have a concept transfer of our own embodied cognition to objects. So we would map our own perception of our bodiness to that objects. And there are, I mean, spatial cognition and language, it's a whole thing. And I will make sure that I don't dive too deep into, but there are just so many things that happen unconsciously, like knowing the difference between a bottle and a car, because a bottle, it represents more how a person would look. So we adopt our embodied view, and for a car we would unconsciously say it's not standing, it's not lying on the street, but it's standing on the street, because we see the affordances and how we use a car, and this implies automatically which verb we should use. And native speakers would always do this correctly, with having those concepts in the back of their minds without ever thinking about them.
Yeah, and to continue with the spatial fun, and just ask yourselves this question. What lies further south, Madrid or Washington, D.C.? And I mean, by now you probably know what I'm getting at, because I just primed you so very, very subtle. It is actually, Washington, D.C. is further south than the city of Madrid in Spain. And this is because of verbalization reinforces misconceptions. Speaking of Spain as in the south, it's, yeah, but not one word would say Washington is in the south of North America, because Washington is not in the south of North America, but Spain is to Europe. So for a typical European, Spain lies in the south and it's warm there. And Washington, on the other hand, it's not, and it's not perceived as a warm, southerny country. So you would not think it lays more southerly than Madrid. And just because it's not located in the south of the country, Washington, D.C. in the USA, the concept that it generally cannot be located south is then immediately transferred into our minds. This relation of the thing to its container overrides possible relations to other entities outside of the container. And it's the same for other things. You have concepts in your mind and these things bias you. So if you ask yourselves the question, what is the largest desert in the world? And then I tell you, it's not the Sahara, it's the Antarctic. Because the key characteristic of every desert is the amount of rainfall. But for many, many people, the concept of a desert is a very, very sunny, very sandy location. And the Antarctic is not a very sandy location. So you wouldn't think of it as a desert. You might call it a snowy desert. But the typical desert is not the Antarctic, but although it is the world's largest desert, yeah, keep this fun fact in mind when you go to post-corona parties.
Yeah, talking about spatial linguistics, this is also something that amazed me when I found out about it. So this is a lot of studies on spatial frames of reference is from the Levinson group in Nijmegen, and they follow the basic idea of linguistic relativity. So it has been shown that people from different parts of the world would use completely different concepts when it comes to the verbalization of spatial relations. So the way how we Westerners would describe spatial relations, we usually use also, like on the bottle experience, we use our own body as a ground and say, okay, this is to my right, this is to my left. And we would see objects and things in relation to ourselves, oftentimes. But people in Namibia, for example, they would describe most of the spatial relations using a cardinal system. So they would, and not only for a mountain and a tree where you can say, okay, it's large scale, so why not using cardinal directions? They would also say the glass on the table is south of the book. So this is very different concepts that people have, and for them it's really hard to remap it. And for us, for example, we wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to tell the cardinal directions at every given minute. So this is another great example for how what you learned in your past, how you're educated, will influence how you speak, brutally.
Yeah, and now to complete our experiment part, we'd like to shamelessly talk about our own thesis. So what we did there, we already know that there are differences when it comes to different languages. And we wanted to find out what happens if subjects actually speak the same language, but practice different cultural practices. And we compared people playing a certain kind of computer games, namely 3D action games with a first person or third person perspective, and doing it on a regular basis, of course, and people who are not doing this. And the first thing we let them do was a wayfinding task. And participants needed to go from point A to point B, and they knew beforehand that they would describe their way afterwards. But keep in mind, we used a game with a virtual world mimicking our own world to a very detailed degree. So gamers would not have an advantage describing weird gamey details that non-gamers would not. You see there's an image of the world actually we used in this computer game. It has mountains, it has fields, it would exactly mimic a wood or park in our own world. And turns out, even not considering technical language, there were huge differences when subjects described the virtual world they just visited. And there also were a lot of similarities that demonstrate how concepts are identical, but yeah, let's focus on the different things. And it turns out that gamers give way more information in general and more true facts even. Non-gamers made more false statements or left out parts or landmarks entirely. They walked past a waterfall in the virtual world or a huge tree, very isolated. So you would notice, of course, the very, very huge tree, and non-gamers would just not describe it afterwards. And also evident was that they used different frames of references, and this would make it possible for other people to reconstruct the path if gamers told the way, because if you listen to a description from a gamer, you would more easily be able to follow the same path. And whereas non-gamers had difficulties remembering exact directions, and they made more mistakes, for example, in forms of wrong directions, left or right, for example. So we have the same language, we have different cultural practices, and we have an environment that is somehow our worldish, and we have very, very huge differences among just a group of people.
And what we found, because we also had a second game that you can see here, because we also wanted to see what happens when people are in a world that not really looks like our own. And this was so surprising because we asked the people to describe the world they were in, and the non-gamers would not say that the parts of the world were flying. They would just not mention that themselves were a bird, but okay, this is not really part of the world, but they would just not say that it was in the air, that there were clouds. They wouldn't in the same extension describe how the different parts were related to each other. They would just describe what they would see on the different islands that they were visiting. So we concluded that this is, of course, a matter of being used to a cultural practice like playing video games, and that gamers are so focused on remembering the paths and remembering the worlds, because they might always need to come back and loot and yeah, just have to remember the details. And this is what we perfectly found in speakers that speak the same mother tongue. They are about the same age, just seeing if they play video games or not. And yeah, I hope we already answered indirectly the question of why we should bother. But of course, we will also have an explicit part that starts right now. So why is all this what you heard important for us as language people in a tech world?
Yeah, and that's because we are confronted with language from two sides. On the one hand, we use it to communicate with our users, of course, and on the other hand, users obviously use natural language to talk to our chatbots or to our voice applications. And we sure need to understand both sides when we make conversation to users or when users make conversation to us. And as we communicate with our systems in the same way, we would talk to people. If I say, okay, Alexa is helping me, setting me timer, reminding me on stuff, or playing music to me, I of course see her as a person-like thing, and that's what people do. We transfer the same concepts and rules of communication, and we applying these to chatbots and speakers alike. And that leads, of course, to a lot of responsibility on our side. You can see that with Google Duplex, for example, and they made a very, very human-like voice that could make you appointments on your behalf. But when people knew they were just called by a robot and they didn't realize it was a robot, they tend to get frustrated. And it's deception for them because it was so lifelike and they did not knew it was a robot. And yeah. Yeah, you've probably all read the article on Voice.ai. So this is about representation too, but about the personas and pictures of our voice or chatbot applications. And this study showed that users are more forgiving when the application constitutes an image of a toddler or other cute things, rather than to a know-it-all expert person, because we know when an expert person does simple mistakes, for example, not understanding us, the gap is much, much higher than if you have the image speaking to a toddler who still have to learn to communicate or to be in our human world. So on the other hand, this might lead to problems when it comes to the confidence and trust users should put into your applications. And a cute bot could be its only purpose be conversational. And so you would make them rather more likable than professional. But when the applications should solve complex tasks, users want a more expert persona. I mean, you would certainly forgive this cute Pikachu bot some mistakes he probably made, but would you give him your bank account data? Yeah, it's the same with stereotypes. I mean, whether we like it or not, we have to deal with the fact that, for example, a male bot is considered more competent to help users with car mechanics questions than a female perceived bot persona. And yeah, this is hard to read, but that's the world we live in, because we are dealing with humans who have these concepts in their mind, and we have to know these concepts to cater to their needs, to design chatbot personas who they think are competent and can actually solve their problems.
But as Anna already mentioned, it's not only about our bot personas, but also about our user personas. And what we need to really focus on is how the personas actually talk like. And we have seen that people might have misconceptions on their own language and the formulations they would use. So this is why we really need to focus on real data and actual data took in the exact situation, because otherwise we will always have recreated images of how people would speak, and this would automatically lead to other misconceptions. And we need to know the concepts our users actually have. So we have to know how aware they are of technical systems, how they are aware they are of the situation they are in, because they will completely change the way they express themselves. They will change the focus and the emphasis on what they're talking about. And yeah, we have to be aware of this and never trust users' introspection ever. When it comes to language, this is never a good idea to ask people, would you like it to say it this way or say it that way? You can never trust it. You always have to find out, make A and B tests and then see what happens. But if you just ask users about their perception of a potential formulation, this will always lead to problems. And yeah, this is also how people will talk, is when we talked about conceptual metaphors, really find out what people would say, because people will always use pragmatics in a very, very intuitive way. And maybe they will not say, I want to change my address, but they say, I've moved. Or they would say, I got married, when they actually want to change their name in the system. So this is what you really need to find out. And this also leads to the question, how should we construct our intent? Should we really try to focus on how people express things so we can disambiguate it better? Or should we rather focus on collecting a number of utterances that will probably lead to the exact same answers? So how sharp should we be? Should we really try to follow Grice's maxims and really differentiate between how and if questions, so we can give a very exact answer and get the people at the points where they really want to feel like this is a normal conversation with a person. And users might act in situations differently because there are different schema that have been triggered. So even though people might know how to communicate with a bot and that an easier language would be better to understand, they may have different concepts that just kick in. So for example, in this situation, you see a bot or the representation of a bot for job appliance, and people tend to write long text in those situations because they have the mindset of, okay, it's about the job and I need to be very polite and I have to follow the rules that I learned in school, how to write this kind of text. And then they will completely forget the mental model they might have about how to communicate with the chatbot, because the stronger model, let's say, will override their model of how to communicate with the bot. And also they might not have concepts of the system boundaries. For example, we see over and over again that people copy paste utterances that weren't understood, and they have no idea of, if they just rewrite the exact same thing, the system will give the exact same answer, except if you have a really good error handling. So this is also that you should consider in your error handling, that people might just copy paste the same things. And that even when you tell them to put it into different words, could you paraphrase that, people might not know what you mean by that. They don't have a concept of how to put things into different words. So they might just add a verb or whatsoever that will not actually help them to get to where they want to be, because they don't really think about the language they use and how they might things or how they might put things into different words. Yes, and this is also our very last slide. So if there are not only billions and billions of different phrases or wordings or expressions, there are as many different concepts and of one situation as there are speakers talking about that. So yeah, and people using the exact same sentence can mean completely different things by expressing the same sentence. So we need to be aware of the fact that even if people enter the same phrase, they can have very different concepts and mental models. And we really need to guide our users why we build up mental models, because when we interact, as we just try to explain, we will create images, we will create pictures in their minds, and we need to be very careful about that so that they can construct a holistic picture themselves that they can easily integrate in the concept that they already have built up over the last centuries, maybe. It's decades. The word is decades. So users assume, on the other hand, that we can intuitively assume the situation they're in. They think that we have an idea of their context, because if they utter something, they feel like, okay, the person will, or the system will know what situation I'm in, because they are used to communicating with other people who have visual input, who can assume the situation. And this is why they will transfer so much information without saying a single word about them. And we have to be very aware of that. And that's it.
Thank you so much. So now I'm reappearing. Thank you so much for the talk. Yes, hi. And I see that there's a couple of questions in the Q&A section. Would you care to open them yourselves? You have access, right? I don't have to read them to you.
Yes, I think, okay, let's start with the first one. In the case of metaphors, can natural language processing and machine learning be used in conversational UX design? How is it designed really? Let me think about that.
Yeah, I'm having trouble understanding how is it designed, how you design machine learning or NLP, or how we can accustom those techniques to the use of metaphors in language. Maybe we just go with one reading to this.
Yes. As the question was posed anonymously, I have no way to unmute the person who asked it, but feel free to write it in the chat if you have something to add to the question in regards to what Anne just asked.
But I would say I have just a very, very vague understanding of NLP and machine learning, because I'm a mere phonologist. But I would imagine that if you put data into those systems, especially for dead metaphors, they would know what those means. But yeah, of course, if you tell a computer, Andrew kicked the bucket, the computer might think that Andrew really kicked the bucket and not the metaphorical meaning of being dead. But this is something I have no understanding of how any of this works.
So, I mean, we actually, yes, as long as we talk about machine learning, we have to teach them. So when I actually don't know about if we do it by networks and semantic networks, but when we just train our intents as we normally do, of course we have to actually be aware of those metaphors that could be used, and we have to come up with all those notions that might lead to the same concepts that the users want to express. And this is where we obviously run into problems sooner or later, because we all are so not aware of all the concepts that might lead to the same things. And probably if you have enough data to teach your your system that when people normally say, "Oh, I'm cold," and you have a situation where a window is open, then of course you can program it to understand that maybe the window should be closed. But this is the magic of human mind, that we can just assume those things. And I think it will take a long way until this comes very naturally to computers. So how does design of a chatbot differ from that of a voice assistant, given that both the elements use language as the users are humans? This is a great question. And actually, spoken and written language are extremely different. We have been talking about the aspect of users not really being aware of the language they use, and this is so much stronger in spoken language, because when writing, you always have the concrete interaction. You really need to think and make an effort to type, and this is even though we don't realize it when we do it the whole time, it is way less natural than just speaking your mind. And oftentimes while talking, we just construct the information we actually want to pass to our listeners. And while writing, we always have to take those little moments, and we can read it and we can correct ourselves. So spoken language is even more focusing on context. It uses a lot of incorrect and incomplete sentences. We will use more anaphoras, so where we refer back to something, but do it very badly, let's say, because written we will look back, okay, is it understandable? Can we really make sense out of those two sentences and their combination? And while speaking, we don't have this possibility. We can just press a pause button and review what we are maybe or have been about to say. So this is something that we really need to take care about in our designs, because we need to guide the speakers or the users way more in voice designs. And on the other hand, we also have to make sure that we don't overload our listeners, our users, with information, because if they can read, they can go back, they can read again, they can reread, but they can't re-listen. So they can't, if we give a huge list of information, they can't be like, okay, wait, I go back, I want to listen to it again. Or it will be very complex to build this in a natural feeling way into a system. So for both the input and the output, we actually have to be very aware of the differences that exist between spoken and written language, and our mental capacity to deal with the different input.
Yeah, the mere possibility in a chatbot that you can see your conversational history as a user is changing it different for a great part. I mean, you could Google in the meantime. If you don't understand a word the chatbot is giving you or a concept, you can just Google it and then answer questions within the UI. And yeah, with spoken words, you really can't do that if you don't understand a word, but we could prepare that if we have a voice application and we need to be aware of users asking, what was that? Come again, what was the last word you used? And it would be good if our voice assistants could handle those questions too.
Okay, I say, so we're already at 8. There's still some question. If you don't bother, I take the time to answer them for all the people who need to leave. Just so. And thank you so much for being here. Because the next question is also really interesting. It is, what do you think about how vocal assistants and the language they speak shape the world we live in and the future world? And one of the aspects that we really need to talk about in this context is also a bias or biases in general that can be reinforced by voice bots. So the first thing that has been discussed a lot, but not enough in my opinion, is how female stereotypes might be reinforced by voice bots. Because you have, when you take Siri, Alexa, Google, the default voice is always female, and when you just be aware of what tasks you ask them to do, they are also stereotypically linked to classical female tasks like remembering stuff, helping doing the shopping list, and this would be still okay, but the worst part starts when voice bots or chat bots get insulted, and this happens a lot. And you can treat them in a horrible way and they have no way to defend themselves. So this might reinforce the concept of female characters and personas just being fine with being insulted, and in the worst case just not reacting to this very strong language. But the norm, it is still not the usual reaction for bots to really deal with sexualized or harmful language. They just don't react, or they say stuff like, oh, this is not very nice. And this reinforces horrible representations of how not to interact with people in general, not only female, of course. And otherwise, I mean, there's so much that has been written about it. There's also the question of children. Do we need to teach children to be polite when they deal with voice assistants, or do we teach them a weird conceptualization of how to deal with technique? And yeah, but I think this will take too much time to elaborate on this too. But obviously, as voice assistants are now part of our world, they will become part of our concepts. And as designers, we have to be very aware of the fact that, of course, we influence how people interact with the systems by writing dialogue and making people interact in one way or another.
So next question for me would be, what do you think will be a VOI game changer in the next few years? What new abilities do you think will influence and improve the current experiences most? And yeah, for me, this would be, of course, better and better models. So you better and better understand people, and our voice applications can speak better and better. And of course, also availability in, hopefully every language you can think of. So you can, have a voice assistant in the language you feel most comfortable in. But also a big thing for me is, environmentally computing somehow, that you just go through our world and you can speak to a voice assistant if you want to at every given moment in time. So if you're waiting for the bus, you could ask just the bus station when the next bus comes, and how do you get there, how expensive the ticket will be. So of course, this also sounds a little bit dystopian maybe if we have voice applications everywhere, but if we just dream there for a little and just avoid all the bad implications we're having with that, if we ask at every time, at every situation we are in, I mean, this could be a great game changer, because you have help available everywhere, and for every person. You don't have to have a smartphone to know whether the bus comes now, to buy a ticket, because there is a smart assistant helping you, and whether you have a smartphone or not. So availability, I think, is a great issue for voice assistants. And now I'm lost what the next question is.
Yes, it changed. Because of the voting.
Oh, because of the voting.
I think it might be the one when you write for VOI, so you work with a design system.
When you run for voice user interfaces, do you work with the design system or chat box specific style guide? Are these speech patterns easily documentable, or does the scope? Wow, I won't read everything out, sorry. So when I design personally, I don't know if this really focuses the question, but as far as I understand it, for every system, for every application, I try to have our own style guide based on the persona that we develop together with the people working on it. And you can't separate a persona from the language it speaks. So we try to focus on the model of the big five, so the personality model, and try to focus on personality traits in the first place that need to go together with the actual actions that a persona needs to take. And then in the second place, we try to figure out, based on those personality traits, what the language should sound like. Because this is also another aspect that personality traits and formulations, mannerisms, that it is directly linked and people will always notice it. So there is not a general design pattern to be applied, but an approach of deriving speech patterns from personality traits that might be combined and recombined for every persona that we work with. So this is how we deal with this and try to, get the language we use in an application straight over all the prompts we write in the first place, but also transport personality and therefore the mental model that our users would create. Okay, have there been...
Yes, because I sorted the questions a bit, so there's 2 questions left.
Nice, Sarah.
Oh. Sorry.
Okay, then I go. Have there been studies within cognitive linguistics domain about the use of VOIs? I mean, in this webinar, we presented on studies about chatbots. I think, but of course there are. I mean, we talked about stuff. We talked about gender stereotypes, and this is also true for VOIs. I mean, Alexa and Siri are perceived as female personas, and all the gender stereotypes comes within those domains and areas too. But of course it's a kind of newer-ish topic, but there are of course many studies there. If you are particularly interested in this, I can just recommend ResearchGate, and you can type there VOIs, and then you can see all the studies ResearchGate has for VOIs, and it's always fun to read them. They're very interesting.
And I mean, it is also, as we said, there is not this one theory of cognitive linguistics. There are so many different directions that can be taken. And there are a lot of overlaps, especially nowadays, between cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics, where even we sometimes have no idea how to. So we were thinking about, okay, should we try to give the differences, because people might ask, but actually we can't because it's so intertwined over the years. So there are a lot of studies, but what we also see in cognitive linguistics is that there are still a lot of ideas and concepts that are developed in the famous ivory tower. So people are still focusing on questions that have been studied for 50 years, or and maybe this could also be cool to shift it. But in the first place, it's hard to answer the question based on the fact that we can't say, okay, this would be a study that falls under cognitive linguistics, and this is something that is psycholinguistics, this is something that is human factors focusing on linguistics. So yeah. And there is one last question. Frames. Do you? I'm not sure if by this question is meant frames in terms of the frame theory, like having mental frames that you would apply And if it is, this might be a way, of course, if you have your stereotype and frames, you could probably train models to understand them. But as Anna already said, this is really not our domain.
Yeah, but a machine knowing pragmatics would be really great, though. I mean, I think we're all looking forward to this day when Alexa knows what I mean when I just say I need help, because she knows the context. I mean, this is going with many, many more voice assistants having also integrated cameras. So the machine can actually see what we are doing. I think this is a great step forward to pragmatics and context. Not for many, many people, but I think you can choose if you want your voice assistant also seeing you and your flat. So yeah, it would be very, very cool if machines would know context and pragmatics.
And maybe also on a closing note on that, because this is also an aspect that is so important, which is the notion of embodiment. We live embodied in this world. We have a body. We can't have our minds, our language, our concepts without being part of this world and being constituted in flesh and interacting with the world, having sensory information, having visual information. And we combine all that together to make language work. And this is something that still lacks to voice and chat assistants. So this will also be something that we need to overcome over time too. How do we teach machines this embodied experience that is the most normal thing for people to have?
Great closing statement. Yeah, then the cat comes. Yeah, cat appears when you tell closing statements. It's a rule, people. I can't change it. Sorry.
I've also already seen Laura's dog in the background, so there was some pet support going on here. Always great.
Sorry.
No, she's a welcome guest. Okay, everyone, so that was it for the questions. And I guess with that, all there's left to do is say many, many thanks to Laura and Anne. Really, the chat also mirrors that. Thanks for sharing your insights. It was super, super valuable. Language truly is the most amazing thing of all. And also many thanks for everybody who joined this webinar. Your participation is also highly appreciated. And I think we all got enough thought-provoking impulses to keep us busy for some days. I know that I am. And I'm still touched by Laura's description of love being a vessel you can dive into. I thought that was so beautiful.
It's not me, it's a concept.
But you put it in the words and they were really, really beautiful. But that being said, from my side at least, yes, I wish everyone a great evening or day, wherever you joined in today. And pretty soonish, of course, also happy holidays. And stay safe, take care, and many thanks again.